Hello from New York, I'm Chris Hayes. Preliminary reports suggest shoppers spent $11.2 billion hunting for holiday deals on Black Friday, which is slightly down from the $11.4 billion spent on the same day last year. And Egypt's judges are calling for a strike to protest the nearly unlimited power President Mohamed Morsi granted for himself on Thursday. We'll be talking about Morsi's power grab later in the program. Right now, my story of the week: what we are doing in the Middle East. The good news in the Middle East this week, and good news from the region can sometimes seem in short supply, is that Hamas and the Israeli government reached a ceasefire agreement to stop the escalating violence between the two that left 6 Israelis and 168 Palestinians dead in the course of a week. Upon announcement of the ceasefire, Gazans streamed out into the streets to celebrate, while Israeli public opinion was decidedly cooler towards the news. One poll showed that 31% of Israelis approved of the ceasefire, while 49% were opposed. Though Hamas paid a heavy price during the bombardment, the destruction of main government buildings, the death of its military commander Ahmed al-Jabari, as well as, according to estimates, over 50 other fighters and an unknown amount of munitions destroyed in bombings, it was also able to point to the ceasefire as a concrete victory. The text of the ceasefire reads in part, Israel should stop all hostilities in the Gaza Strip, land, sea, and air, including incursions and targeting of individuals. That means no more operations like the one that killed Jabari. And Israel is to commence, quote, opening the crossings and facilitating the movements of people and transfer of goods, and refraining from restricting residents' free movements and targeting residents in border areas, and procedures of implementation shall be dealt with after 24 hours from the start of the ceasefire. That is widely seen as a commitment to loosen the onerous restrictions Israel has placed on all movements of people and goods in and out of Gaza. In other words, if it holds, and that is definitely a big if at this moment, it will represent a net benefit to the estimated 1.7 million people living in the Gaza Strip. For example, Israel has already reportedly eased restrictions on fishermen in the waters around Gaza, allowing them to go twice as far out as they could before the latest hostilities. Now, human rights organizations and Palestinian groups and members of the international community have been calling for easing of these restrictions since the effect of Gaza was first initiated in 2006, and after international pressure in 2007 and again in 2010, reforms were made. But after firing roughly 1,500 rockets at Israel, at its civilian centers, and killing 6 people, Hamas can then turn around credibly claiming that their military tactics worked, that they brought about a change in Israeli policy. And this isn't the first time that Hamas has emerged from a violent confrontation with Israel with a concrete policy victory. In 2006, Hamas kidnapped Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit and held him for more than 5 years before the Netanyahu government, through back-channel negotiations, secured his release in exchange for the release of 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. Now, you might say this isn't a perfect world, and realpolitik requires dialogue with Hamas, even negotiations with them when it is called for, and I'd say you're absolutely right. But it also requires the same with respect to the body that represents Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, the Palestinian Authority. And the posture of the Israeli government towards the government of Mahmoud Abbas, a posture either explicitly endorsed or tacitly tolerated by our own government, makes for an extremely disquieting contrast. Now, as head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas has renounced violence, even uses security forces of the PA to go after militants. He accepts and recognizes Israel and its right to exist, and he's even gone so far in recent interviews to more or less admit that Palestinians would concede their right to return to the land they or their families held before 1948 inside what is now Israel. In return for this, he has seen basically nothing, except for the continued settlement growth. When Abbas took over the PA, there were a little more than 250,000 settlers established in settlements in the West Bank. Today, there are 350,000. Assume for the sake of argument for a moment that Hamas targets Israeli civilians not solely because of some unalterable cult of death, but that it also adopts this as a tactic, however morally abhorrent, to achieve certain aims. This idea that terrorism is a tactic adopted by certain groups was articulated by a young state senator at a book event back in 2004.
Ultimately, terrorism is a tactic. So it's not, we're not fighting terrorists, we're fighting people who engage in terrorism, but have a whole host of rationales and excuses for why they do this, and to the extent that we can change the sense of opportunity in many of these countries, and we can change the manner in which we function in these countries in more positive, proactive ways, then we're not going to eliminate terrorism entirely, but we're at least going to be able to make more of a dent than if all we're resorting to is military firepower.
Though you are unlikely to hear the current incarnation of Barack Obama articulate this point of view, I happen to think it's pretty sound analysis. And so the question is, what message is the Israeli government and the U.S. government that supports it sending when it makes choices that result in Hamas being able to point to its many victories and leaves Mahmoud Abbas and his government totally impotent and humiliated, roundly viewed as feckless and failed? And here's the lesson as far as I can tell. If you recognize Israel, if you are credibly committed to nonviolence, you will get rolled, marginalized, undercut, and left looking like a loser. But if you fire rockets into the heart of Israel, if you kidnap their soldiers, well then, they'll negotiate and adjust their policies. How perverse is that? And believe me, everyone I've talked to on the Palestinian side sees this disparity. In fact, none other than Hamas political leader Khalid Mashal explicitly cited Abbas's sorry situation in an interview with Christiane Amanpour on Wednesday.
Mahmoud Abbas, whom the world welcomed, he gave this opportunity to Israel and to the international community. What did they do? They made him fail. They let him down.
In allowing this to continue, in refusing to pressure the Israeli government to take concrete steps towards peace in the West Bank, stopping all settlement growth, they're turning a blind eye. In turning a blind eye while unarmed protesters in towns like Budrus and Nabi Saleh are imprisoned, tear-gassed, and in some cases shot and killed by IDF soldiers away from the eyes of American cameras, with no condemnation from our government, we in the U.S. are creating the conditions in which terrorism, the great evil we have pledged ourselves to vanquish, brings strategic benefits, while the path of nonviolence leads to a dead end. What a sorry legacy for everyone involved in helping this come to pass. I want to bring in Congressman Steve Cohen, Democrat of Tennessee, Katrina vanden Heuvel, my colleague at The Nation magazine, where she's editor and publisher, Hussein Ibish, senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, which advocates for a two-state solution, and Heather Hurlburt, former special advisor of President Clinton, former member of the Clinton State Department Foreign Policy Planning Team, now executive director of the National Security Network. This is my takeaway from the set of incentives that have been created in the region. Hussein, I'm curious, as someone who is a very outspoken advocate for a two-state solution, if this is how you see things as well.
I think, yes, to some extent.
Feel free to disagree. I'm not.
Well, I'll tell you where I did disagree minorly with some of the things that you said. I think overall your analysis is correct. The incentive structure that has been created does certainly encourage Palestinians to think that negotiations, diplomacy, cooperation with the West and Israel are a dead end, and that all the PA has to show for its efforts are not being able to pay the salaries of public employees, which they pay in both the West Bank and in Gaza, except from 2 months back, and Israeli settlement activity continuing and all of that. As you said, they have little to show for their general approach of trying to reach a negotiated agreement. I'm not sure that Hamas has actually achieved much in this conflict.
They claim they do. We should distinguish those two.
I want to say that the agreements with Israel regarding blockade and with Egypt regarding the easing of the blockade are very vague. They're being negotiated today. I mean, there's an agreement to negotiate things about them, which are continuing today in Cairo. They may be temporary. They may be very, very limited, and they may never materialize at all. What Hamas has gained is first of all, a certain diplomatic breakthrough. The Emir of Qatar went there before this happened, and while it was going on, the Prime Minister of Egypt went there, the Foreign Minister of Turkey and the Foreign Minister of Tunisia went there. The Prime Minister of Turkey may go also. In other words, what Hamas has been able to do is kind of break out of
recognition.
Break out of its diplomatic cage a little bit, and that's the benefit. The other thing is that this is a benefit to the people, the Hamas factions in Gaza, who are fighting an internal power struggle with the external leadership abroad that used to be based in Damascus and is now dispersed all over the place. So I think for different factions in Hamas, they've achieved things politically for themselves. The people of Gaza may be in a sense of euphoria, but there's going to be a hangover when the dust settles, when they bury the dead and count the costs. And there ought to be, as there was after Cass led in 2008, 2009, a clear contrast with a much better situation in the West Bank. But today, Today there isn't one, and that's a tragedy. And that means that Hamas might actually be able to spin this into a long-term political benefit for themselves.
The inverse and the counter-argument to what I just made is, would you rather be living in Gaza or the West Bank, right?
Well,
I mean, in some
still
ways,
would be the West Bank without question.
That's my point, right? That
That's not really the question that's being asked, okay, because everyone's living under occupation. The question that Palestinians are being posed is, would you rather rot slowly under a kind of collaborative capitulation in the West Bank where you try to cooperate and get nothing for it, or would you rather go down in a blaze of glory for God and country, you know, with all, you know, and with under the rocket's red glare? People faced with a choice like that will, generally speaking, prefer the second. They'd rather go down in a blaze of glory. So what they need is to be provided a third alternative, which is
constructive engagement.
Progress towards freedom, independence, and improvement in quality of life through negotiations and diplomacy. We've got, by the way, a UN bid coming up. How Israel and the United States and the rest of the West react to that is going to be a huge role in determining how this conflagration plays out in the coming months.
Let's talk about that. Congressman, I'm just curious from your perch in the United States House of Representatives, how you observe these, the violence in Gaza and the administration's very forthright and clear support for the Israeli government taking steps to in their words, defend themselves.
I've been to Israel twice as a congressperson, once with basically an AIPAC sponsored trip and once with a J Street sponsored trip. Very different in who you met. Now, I think that one thing I think about is a long time ago, Elie Wiesel discussed the President Reagan going to Bitburg, and he said he looked around the world, and if he was looking today, he'd say, I look at the Congo, and I look at Afghanistan, and I look at Syria, and I despair. But despair can never be the answer. You always have to have hope. And we still have to have hope. And the problem in the Middle East does appear to be despair. But I think the problem is, and I don't know how you get around it, the President has to try to bring about some type of accord, is that Netanyahu suffers from the same problem that Romney did. They see the world only from their perspective, and it's from their view, and they don't see the greater world being what's the numbers and the population and the future, and they're not prepared for it. They're hunkered down, and Israel can't continue to be hunkered down and survive because they're going to be outnumbered by...
Well, they've been outnumbered for a long time, and I think there's a lot of fear that the tumult of the Arab Spring has only greater danger.
Fortress Israel.
Right.
The Iron Dome was beautiful, and that was President Obama in the United States helped fund the Iron Dome.
Dome is a missile defense, sort of rocket defense weapon system that was able to shoot down rockets that were incoming.
85% accuracy at best.
Hold on one second. I want to talk more about this and about what the U.S. government can do to bring about a two-state solution, if that is actually the stated aim, right after this.
If you think you missed out on Black Friday prices at the Home Depot.
Let's understand what the precipitating event here was that's causing the current crisis. And that was an ever-escalating number of missiles that were landing not just in Israeli territory, but in areas that are populated. And there's no country that would tolerate missiles raining down on its citizens from outside its borders. So we are fully supportive of Israel's right to defend itself from missiles landing on people's homes and workplaces and potentially killing civilians. And we will continue to support Israel's right to defend itself.
This is President Barack Obama back on November 18th in Thailand talking about the escalation in Gaza. And I think what that highlights to me is the fact that the U.S.'s role in the region is ostensibly it has two roles. One is obviously Israel is a great ally. There's tremendous domestic political support for a strong relationship with Israel. At the same time, it is also supposed to be the kind of neutral arbiter, the mediator in the region that's going to bring this about. And it seems to me that we don't do a very good job playing both those roles. Those two roles are in tension.
Well, those two roles have always been in tension. They've grown more in tension over time. You had 8 years of an administration that really gave up on trying to play the arbiter role, at which point the fig leaf kind of came away. The administration did a great job, actually, tactically playing both of those roles, and, you know, in a way that they hadn't done at all during the first term, sending the Secretary of State out to be the arbiter while the president could give the defender of Israel speeches like that. Now, that's a tactical solution that doesn't get anywhere near the long-term structural problem that it isn't the same Middle East that it was 5 years ago. And what do you do instead? How do you serve both the long-term interests of Israel, especially when maybe many Americans don't see Israel's long-term interests the same way Israel's ruling party does,
right,
and the U.S. long-term interest of having better relationships with Egypt, figuring out, you know, we're not talking about the hundreds of people who died in Syria over the time of Gaza. So we've got a long-term, you know, the administration did a great job on the short term, but we've got a long-term problem that our political don't necessarily let us figure out how to deal with.
I do think, picking up on what Heather is saying, I think this crisis poses an ultimate test for the Obama administration in regard to the recent transformation in the Middle East. I mean, you see it in the fascinating relationship between President Obama and Mohammed Morsi. Two pragmatists trying to find a way to mediate this immediate conflict. You see it against the backdrop of an Islamist government in Turkey. You see it against the backdrop of surprising riots in Jordan, which will cause increasing problems. So you have that changing environment, which you know far more about. But the Arab Street needs something different. Though a cliche, these governments now need to be more responsive to their people, so that is an opening for a different relationship. And the president, no American president is going to criticize, I would argue, Israel's launching of this war, but it is an opening for a relationship with Egypt, with Turkey, to implement a ceasefire that will monitor arms smuggling into Gaza, that will monitor Israel's relationship, but overarching all of it. And this is it's such a painful issue to discuss, and anything we say on this show is going to be criticized. Overarching, I do think, overarching all of it is a history, going back at least to '67, of the United States' role, maybe, you know, but the